In this video we're going to talk about program flow. We'll start by talking about branching and then follow it up with recursion. When we talk about program flow, what we mean is modifying how the application executes based on either conditions within our application or, in the case of recursion, looping through a series of items. So this changes the flow of the application from a line by line by line, and could potentially skip lines or repeat lines of code depending on the syntax that we use. So we're going to start with branching, and branching allows us to add some intelligence to our applications. By intelligence, we can have our application make decisions about what it should do based on checks or evaluations of values within our application. So what we have here is a simple application called Lesson 10, and it's a simple WinForm application that has a text box called TXT taxable amount and then a button called BTN calculate. Let's write some code for BTN calculate, and what I want to do is grab the value from the TXT taxable amount and put it in a variable called taxable amount. So let's go ahead and dimension a variable taxable amount as double, and then taxable amount equals double dot parse, and then txt taxable amount dot text. So now we have our value. Let's add our first branching statement, and we'll use an if then else statement, or just if then statement to begin with. Taxable amount is greater than 100, then take taxable amount and set it equal to taxable amount times 0.95. So if this line of code is true, if it returns a true, this statement, then we'll execute this line of code. If not, then we'll simply skip this line of code and continue on the program flow throughout the rest of the application. Let's go ahead and add one additional statement to the if-then syntax, and that is else. So in this case, if this statement returns a false, then we will skip this line of code and execute this line of code instead. Let's go ahead and run our application one time. Actually, let's stop our application because we have no way of knowing at this point what our result is. So we got to display that in a message box. .show taxable amount .toString, and here we go. Now we're ready to go. Let's go ahead and type in 100 and click calculate, and notice that it returns us 90. Let's check this against the code that we have. If taxable amount is greater than 100, we typed in 100 to taxable amount. So is 100 greater than 100? No. That means we'll skip this line of code and we'll execute this line of code. So taxable amount equals 100 times 0.9. That would return the value of 90, which is then displayed in our message box. So this works just fine. Let's add some more code to our if then else statement, and we'll add an else if statement. So we can check additional values and additional conditions and then perform even different code based on that. So if taxable amount is less than 10, then taxable amount equals 10. So in other words, if the value we type in is like 8 or 9, 10 will be the minimum, so we'll set it back to 10 and then display the value. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get if we were to type in the value of 7. And it returns the value of 10. Perfect. So that's the first type of branching, the if then else statement. Let's add a combo box to our WinForm. Let's set some properties. Let's clear out the text property. Let's change the name to CBO country. And what we'll do is, based on which country is selected, we'll display a new value for the tax rate. So let's type in Canada, USA, UK, and Mexico. And we'll click OK. And now in our code, let's go ahead, first of all, and dim tax rate as a double. And then we'll display whatever tax rate is in our message box. And what I'll do is I'll paste some code here, which gives us our second type of branching, which is the select case statement. So you can see the select case statement starts here and it ends here. And between those two structures, we have a series of case statements, one for Canada, USA, one for UK. So we will evaluate whatever's in the cbocountry.txt property, and if it's Canada, then we'll execute this line of code. If it's the USA, then we'll execute this line of code, and so on. If there's no case statements that match up with what we're evaluating, then it'll fall into this last case statement, which is case else, and we'll set the tax rate equal to 0.05 in that case. So another way to control program flow, to change it from just running through each line linearly, is to use a select case, and based on conditions it will execute one or more lines of code. Now we could easily have multiple lines of code in here as well, just to let you know. And also the case else statement is optional. You don't have to use that, in which case if none of the selections are appropriate, then it'll just not execute any of this code and follow on with whatever code is outside the end select statement. So let's go ahead and save this and run it to demonstrate how it works. Again, we're merely going to just make a selection and click calculate, and it pops open the tax rate in a message box. Let's select Mexico, which doesn't match any of the case statements, and it falls into the case else and sets it to 0.05. So that's the second way, and the last way that we're going to look at to control program flow using branching for this example. So now we'll move on to recursion to modify the program flow. We're going to add two text boxes onto our form. And recursion will make a lot more sense whenever we get into arrays and collections, so I'm going to do a very mundane, very easy example right now just so you can see how it's used, although it may not make a whole lot of sense at this point why you would want to use recursion within your applications. What I'm going to do is first of all name this txt for next, and then I'm going to name this one txt do while to illustrate the two different ways that we're going to demonstrate how to use recursion within our application. I'm going to double click my form, which will give me a form load event that I can write code for, and here what I'll do is dim current item as integer for current item equals 1 to 10. Gotta spell it right. There we go. And what we'll do here is txt for next.text plus equals current item dot toString. Let me explain what's going on. Notice after I typed in the for statement and hit the enter key in my keyboard that it automatically gave me the next statement. So anything between the for and the next will run until we've satisfied the requirement of the for statement. In this case, we're going to run this so that current item is 1 to 10, and after the 10th time it will exit the for next statement and move on into our code. So the for statement is responsible for incrementing current item. We don't have to do that. So let's go ahead and run our application. And you'll notice right away that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Very good. So in the for statement, we knew exactly how many times we wanted to run the loop. Let's move on to another line of code. This time we'll go ahead and we'll set current item back to 1. We'll do while current item is less than 11. txt do while dot text plus equals current item dot toString. Now in this case, we have to increment current item on our own. In this case, we don't tell the do while statement how many times we're going to run the loop, only that there's certain conditions that need to be met. And once those conditions are violated, then we exit out of the loop and continue on. Now it just so happens that each time when we loop through, I increment current item by 1. But let's say that I want to increment it by 2. It's not obvious to us, at least in this statement, how many times that this loop will actually run. It's also contingent on how many times we actually increment our current item. So there's a small distinction here between the do while and the for next loops. And that is, and how many times it's known up front that we will loop through, as opposed to how many conditions will it take in order for our loop to be satisfied and it exits out. Let's go ahead and run it this time. And we can see here we have 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Apparently we hit 11 and drop out of our loop. Let's add one more example, and we're going to use both types of program flow together. So let's go current item equals 1 to 10. And this time we'll check if current item equals 4, then show we found item 4. So in this case, we will loop through 1 to 10 times and check the value of current item each time. If the value is 4, then we will execute this line of code. If not, we'll continue on looping through current item from 1 to 10. Once we find item 4, not only will we display the message box, but I'm also going to show you how to exit out of a for next loop or even a do while loop. In the case of the for next, we would use exit 4. And once we found item 4, it won't execute any more iterations through current item. So it'll only go from 1 to 4 and then exit out. In the case of do while, we would change this to exit while. Of course, this is not going to work in the context of our for next loop. What I'm going to do is set a breakpoint, which is a way for us to peek in on the code as it executes, so we can see how the flow of the program is going. And we'll talk about breakpoints and debugging more later on in this series of lessons. So the yellow line indicates the current line of code that we're on, and I'm going to step through each line of code one by one. We can hold our mouse cursor over an item to find out what its current value is. In this case, current item equals 1. Since it's 1, it skips over messagebox.show and the exit 4. Now current item equals 2 because of our statement, the for next statement, and it does not satisfy the results of the if statement. Now current item equals 3. Still no luck. Now current item equals 4. Notice what happens. Our if statement is executed. We'll show a message box. We found item 4. We hit our exit 4 statement. I'm going to step through one more line of code and notice that we drop out of our for next loop and go on to the next line of code, which happens to be an exit sub. And I highly recommend that you read not only the lesson text but also the extended readings, because there are lots of additional variations on what I've shown you here, and you'll get a better insight. But this is meant for an introduction into program flow, and I hope it served that purpose. Thank you.